Hey, what is up, guys? Welcome back to US Election Hub. And today we're going to be talking about the 2020 Democratic primary and really asking the question, can Bernie Sanders win the Democratic nomination in 2020? And can he defeat Donald Trump to become the next president of the United States? And so, without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into it. So, one of the first things we're going to be looking at in relation to Bernie Sanders is the primary field. Who is he going to be up against if he announces a run for the presidency? And so he has numerous opponents because this year in 2019, we can expect so many Democrats to announce they are going to run for the presidency. There's so many speculative candidates, and so I'm just going to be mentioning a few, but there's so many more that I may not mention in this video. But some of the biggest names here are Joe Biden, Beto O'Rourke, Elizabeth Warren, Kamala Harris, Amy Klobuchar, Cory Booker. There's numerous others like Howard Schultz, Jay Inslee from Washington State. There is Michael Bloomberg from New York. He was a former mayor of New York City. There's so many candidates, even people that have already announced, like John Delaney. And I believe there was one more guy who announced from West Virginia, but I'm forgetting his name now. And so, Bernie Sanders does have quite the competition here. But what is good for Bernie Sanders? Well, according to polling, he is actually doing fairly decent. According to the most recent Iowa caucus poll, Bernie Sanders was in second place, just behind Joe Biden. Joe Biden was in first place, leading around by 13 points. And let me just quickly open up the poll here. Iowa Democratic Presidential Caucus poll for you guys. As you guys can see, Joe Biden had 32% support while Bernie Sanders had 19%. So he's basically the second place person right here. And so that's a good thing for Bernie Sanders. He has some work to do, but that's good for him. Now, what else is going to benefit Bernie Sanders? Well, since 2016, he has way more name recognition. In fact, I think most people know who Bernie Sanders is. And the good thing about name recognition is it's going to help him build support for a 2020 campaign. If you go back to 2016, one of the major problems Bernie Sanders faced was that he didn't have name recognition, especially in the African American community, and he focused more on class issues as opposed to a lot of racial issues that African Americans were facing. And therefore, he struggled with African American voters, and also Hilary Clinton just had a longer presence and, support with the African American community. And so we take a look, Bernie Sanders lost numerous states that had high percentages of African Americans. One thing we look to in 2020 is, can Bernie Sanders win the African American vote? And I would say the answer to that is yes. Take a look at this. According to a recent USA Today and Suffolk University poll, what we can find is that around 46% of the African American community actually supports Bernie Sanders for president. The only other person they support much higher is Joe Biden, and I would attribute this to being Joe Biden was a former vice president. He has more name recognition than Bernie Sanders, and he was the vice president of the first African American ever elected to office, Barack Obama. And so that is basically the reason why Joe Biden has more African American support. But if you look at the second place person here, that is Bernie Sanders. He has gotten a lot of credibility in the among African Americans, and so that is benefiting him by a lot, especially in those southern states that are going to be very important in the Democratic primary. If you look at the other two candidates here right below him, these two candidates are actually African American, and if you notice, they're doing okay with African Americans. The only person higher than the third most support for African Americans comes from Elizabeth Warren, and then a lot of African Americans still support Hillary Clinton, around 38%. So it just really tells you how important the African American vote is. And if Bernie Sanders is getting these numbers, he's doing pretty well. He also has to get up his white support here, white liberal support, but I don't think that's going to be too much of a challenge for someone like him. And so let's go ahead and look at some polling real quick. In every matchup poll between Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders defeats Donald Trump. And so this is very interesting if we just look at the most recent polls. Now this one was kind of close, but this pollster is kind of bad. But let's look at Morning Consult. As you can see, there's a lot of undecideds in favor of. There's a lot of undecided voters, but overall, Bernie Sanders is doing very well this far out from 2020. So that's something we have to keep in mind. Now going back to our electoral map here, we're now going to go ahead and start filling this in, and I'm basically going to show you guys a potential election matchup between Donald Trump and show you the scenario in which Bernie Sanders can win, and in a scenario in which Bernie Sanders wins big. So let's go ahead and get right into it. So we're going to fill in the safe Democratic states here, and so the East Coast and the West Coast, they're pretty safe. There we go. Let's go ahead and fill those in. And then we're also going to get Illinois here. Let's go ahead and fill in some safe Republican states as well. So we're going to fill in all these safe Republican states. Texas is probably not going to be a swing state in this election, especially with someone like Bernie Sanders. I actually do not expect it to be a swing state or even close. Maybe Beto or Rourke could make it closer, but it's unlikely that it would be competitive, or at least as competitive. Here we go, South Carolina, Utah, and Alaska here. So we're going to leave the rest of these blank here. So let's go ahead and change our map options. Now let's go ahead and look at some states that are most likely going to go to, are likely Democratic, or they're actually, let me include Colorado in this safe Democratic, and New Mexico. Actually, no, I'm going to put Colorado as lean Democratic. Donald Trump lost here by 5 points. It's still kind of a competitive state, but it is moving a little more blue every year. I still believe Donald Trump will win Arizona, Georgia, and North Carolina. And Donald Trump in 2018 got his Trump-backed candidates in Ohio and Florida won, despite most polls saying they wouldn't. And so I would actually give him those 2 states. But I would actually give Bernie Sanders every other state on this map. Why? Because Bernie Sanders has built the support, the network, and has the capabilities of defeating Donald Trump. The only problem people will probably have with him is his policies, but they're not gonna. But compared to someone like Donald Trump, I think there's gonna be lots of Democratic turnout, and Bernie Sanders will have a larger percent of the African American support this time around, and he does perform better in the Rust Belt, a place that is very competitive. And so for him to do well here, Bernie Sanders, to win the election, he needs to flip the Rust Belt back to blue, and he needs to make sure that he also gets enough turnout in a lot of these other areas that are strongly Democratic. I did forget Hawaii, my mistake there. Let me go ahead and fill that in. Anyways, guys, this is the final electoral map. Sanders 285 to 253. He wins the Northeast over here, New Hampshire and Maine included. He wins all of Maine, and then he wins Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Minnesota. Only reason I did not give him Ohio is because Ohio has become more of a lean red state. Thank you guys so much for watching, and see you guys next time. Bye.